Yeah.
Well,
Well,
very
it is.
tempting.
Well, it is courageous dialogue. So I'm going to kickstart it off and ask you a time that you've been courageous. It can be personal or professional.
Yeah. Oh, gee, Tanya, that's hard. I don't really think about those sorts of things. You just are you talking work or just courageous?
Courageous. It's an interesting question, actually. I've been quite interested in how people have been responding. Some people have gone to quote someone about, what courageous means, and then some people talk about their own sort of personal experience. So I'm just putting it out there, and it's okay. I get what you're saying, Steve, in terms of, I don't really think of those things either, and people just say, wow, you were courageous when you did that. I'm just like, okay.
Well, actually, I reckon I don't know if it's the most courageous, but I can always remember, probably more in relationships than anything else, asking my wife to get married, being courageous enough to ask a girl out. The things that come to my mind.
Yeah.
But yes, there are, conversation. I think anything to do with people is hard, because you don't know how people are going to respond to whatever it is that you are talking about or need to talk about. And, things need to get out so that we can understand each other. So I think, anything that's associated with dealing with people and trying to make things better, it's always vexed, it's always challenging.
Yeah. Okay. So you've actually been overseas and you've taught overseas, and some people might say that was courageous of you when you did that. Tell us a little bit about that experience, if you don't mind.
Well, my wife thought it was courageous because she didn't want to do it at first. It was a fantastic opportunity, and I think anywhere that you go where and I've done this a couple of times, I did it both in the Middle East and India, and you go across and you're perceived as an expert, and it's a bit of a burden to carry, because you're not, and as we all know, education it's a cultural institution, so the rules might be approximately the same, but they're carried out very differently in different countries. One of the things that I found most difficult, and it took me a while to learn this, was that countries in the Middle East and India, they look to the West and they see our education system and say, oh, we want that. We want the same outcomes as what we can see in other countries. But education's it's a community-based thing. It's the people that you are, it's the person that you are, it's your values. And whilst values are the same, they're not entirely the same. And remember, particularly in India, once they worked out what the sort of improvement that they could, undertake, or the journey that they could undertake, it was too much of a cultural change, because education is a representation of us. It's what we believe. It's how we teach our kids. It's how we bring up the next generations. And different cultures don't all do it the same way. And so they think, wouldn't it be great to, have something like a Western education system? But it doesn't really work. So that doesn't bode well for people who want to work as consultants. So but ultimately it's the that cultural barrier which stops it from going forward, or makes it harder for it to go forward.
Okay, so you've got a very interesting background, and we talk lots about different things. So one of the things that I think lends itself to what you're talking about is professional learning communities. And I guess that's sometimes seen as a way to come to those sort of understandings and shared experiences and learning to move communities forward. Should we talk about professional learning communities?
Yeah, let's go for it.
All right, okay. So I'm passionate about professional learning communities when they're designed well.
Yes.
And so I guess I want to talk about, because we've seen, I think, in Victoria, a phase where about 10 years ago, when we worked together, professional learning communities was in, it was a thing, it was going to drive practice, improvements. And then over the last, I think, probably 5 years, that sort of fell away, but now it sort of seems to be coming back again. So in my time that I've jumped back into schools, maybe let's go start there. Do you think that that's happened over the last 10 years, whether it was strong and then it sort of faded away and now it's coming back in?
Yeah, look, it's hard to say, particularly over the last few years, because everything just faded away in the last few years. And certainly the work that, so I do contract work for state education system here in Victoria, and it's the way in which we do it. It's a little bit different than it was a few years ago, and I get to see different interpretations. So you go into schools and some of them say, "Oh yeah, we've been doing PLCs for years," and you start talking to them and you observe their work, and it's not quite what I would call, PLC. So there's many interpretations, and this is why I think that one of the things that the Victorian education system is doing is that it really is trying to build a consistent understanding right across a whole state in terms of what PLCs are, and that's commendable because it's extremely difficult. So I think where it falls down is the different interpretations of it, and so therefore we make it our own. And I go into some schools and they'll be really proud of their collaborative planning. We work together, we come up with these ideas and things like that. But you dig a little bit deeper and it doesn't go beyond collaborative planning. That's all it is. Now, there's nothing wrong with collaborative planning. I've worked in plenty of schools where, I'm nearly 60. When I started teaching, you just did your own planning and you had to work it out. So collaborative planning is a great thing, but it's not PLC. And when you go into a school and they think it is, you have to sort of challenge that notion first in a way that's going to engage them to want to go deeper.
Yeah. So, and then that's when you have the conversations, I guess, about the structures, about the resources, about the difference between collaboration and cooperation. What is PLCs to you then? Like when you think of PLCs, what do you think of?
Well, I think of the L, which is the learning. And we've all been to university. We've all learned to teach. So what does that learning focus on? What is it? You're the teachers, so how does that learning work? And all learning is a collaborative exercise. And the most difficult thing is to focus on critically looking at ourselves. How effective is my practice as a teacher? And so the only thing that I can learn in a school, I can read and I can do this, but really to focus on my practice, I have to work with other teachers. I have to see how other teachers work, how they do it. And that can be really challenging for people. Some people are very, very guarded about their practice. One of the things that's I'm pleased about that's happening is that there does seem to be an opening up in terms of classroom observations and things like that to provide feedback to teachers. And that's seen as a bit of a minefield. And, you know, in the PLC training, we spend hours and hours on how to be able to communicate with each other so that you can do this sort of work. So how people go about that and understand that is really interesting, because I also do school reviews. So one thing that's really interesting when you do a school review, at the end we'll come up with goals, targets and key improvement strategies. And a really common key improvement strategy is improve teacher practice 2, and then just insert whatever, you know, you think you need to get better at. And the problem is always the language, improve teacher practice. And I say, so let's not focus on the teacher. Just change that language around to improve teaching practice rather than teacher practice. Focus on the verb, not on the noun. And then suddenly it becomes a collective. It's a collective, I guess, pursuit, which we all work together to achieve when we focus on teaching, not the teacher.
Yeah, because teacher
so something's not
really,
working,
yeah, because the teacher, when you use that language, it's like it's personal. Whereas if you use teaching, it's a collective, it's the we. So there's nothing wrong with you individually, but as a whole, how are we going to do this? So actually, yeah, the language is really important there.
And it's amazing the number of schools that will use that language based on the nouns, not on the verbs.
Mm.
And when we talk about PLC, I started off with talking about the L. Well, this is now talking about the C, the community. Because when we're working in a community, the focus isn't just on me, it's on us. And so if us or we are to get better, my contribution as a teacher has to be to have a positive impact on the people around me. So if I'm in the grade 3 team, you know, am I the teacher who can help create that morale and camaraderie, which creates a really good working environment that we can work together? And eventually, as a result of working together, build trust. So that community part, I think the language of PLC, you know, it's really well named. You really do have to focus on those.
So as you've been talking, you've hit some key things for me that kind of makes PLC, like in the long term, not work when the foundations aren't built. So you mentioned trust, you mentioned, you know, the language, you mentioned what it needs to look like. What happens, in your opinion, where I guess there's no sort of buy-in, there's no sort of understanding, it's just thrown into a school where, right, we're going to be looking at PLCs now, this is the sort of structure we're going to have. What sort of things that schools need to be aware of if they're going to do that without building those foundations first?
Well, if they don't, and one of the things that we're doing now is that there's a lot of coaching going on. So schools have done the PLC training, and it's a year or 2 years later, and you know it's not quite working as well as they thought that it had. And one of the reasons is that there's fear. You know, right, we're all going to do PLCs. It's going to be fantastic, and you know, this is your role. And when we do that, people feel, well, you know, am I going to be seen for what I am? And we're our own worst enemies. I mean, we see ourselves performing far, you know, much less than how we actually perform. That's how human beings are. so it's that fear, and this is where the language is so important, that you really develop that concept of community and being able to work together. Because if you can't engage in the conversations, you can't do the work. And if you can't do the work, the improvement that you're looking for is not going to happen. It's not going to happen. So you have to be able to do that, and having the conversations about the language and how we talk to each other, and then actually follow that up with this really is the way that we work, that we do work as a team. So, we don't, the principal doesn't come down and say, Tanya, we need to have a discussion, come this way. It really has to be focusing on the team and how the team works, and really getting those norms and, dialogues and all those sorts of things, getting them out into the open. One of the things that teachers fear most is observations, peer observations, and again, same sort of thing. I talk to a lot of teams and teachers about, this will often come up as it's a strategy, improve classroom observation processes, so that we can learn from each other, and that's good, and that really makes sense. You talk to teachers, say, oh, how are you going to do that? Oh, we do learning walks, and learning walks are good, and, they're focused, and you come in, it's a very short period of time. But when you want to look at practice, what teachers are doing, if you're really focusing on those verbs, and you say, my teaching practice, if it's effective, there's only one measure of that, and that's the impact that it's having on student learning. And people say, oh, I don't like to be observed, or if you say, well, use a camera, oh, I don't like having the camera on me, I don't like, all that. And I'm not saying this to overcome those fears. I say to them, okay, well, I'm not going to put the camera on you. I actually want to put the camera on the kids. I'm not all that interested in what you're doing, but what I am interested in, I'm interested in the impact that you're having on the kids. So if you're demonstrating something, doing something, whatever it is, I want to see how the kids respond to that. So, a lot of schools have got swivels and, swivel cameras, and, some of them get used, some of them just sit in a cupboard. And teachers really have a fear of having cameras in the classroom pointed on them. And I say to them, well, don't put them on you. And I'm not saying that to allay their fear. I'm actually saying this to improve the quality of the work. Put it on the kids. Whoever it is, whoever you're sharing the video with, ask the question, what impact is my teaching having on kids?
Yeah. And sorry, I just disappeared there for a second. I am in Darwin. My dad he built a fortress of a house about 50 years ago. The cement is about, double that. So I was surprised that the internet started working today again. So if I disappeared, I'll come back in. But the impact on the kids, and as you were talking, I haven't done this in a while, but I used to have a camera set up in the corner of the room. And I used to always use the habits of the mind, and at any stage throughout the day, the students could choose the habit of the mind and go and turn that video recorder on and just do a little bit of reflection using that habit of the mind. And it was actually quite interesting because, as you were saying, we're hard on ourselves. When you watch the videos, the kids are actually hard on themselves as well in terms of where they were at. So it is quite interesting. So why do you think PLCs don't work?
Fear. Fear of being able to do the work without damaging relationships, I think. That's probably the main one. There can be the other one, can't see the wood for the trees sort of thing. I've got so much to do. This is a pretty common one. Where are we going to fit PLC? Because we're doing this. And any good reform needs to be able to, there ought to be things that you stop doing. And when you go into schools, there's this real sense of, we've already got enough to do, and you want me to do more. You want me to do this PLC thing? I've talked to teachers, it's huge, it dominates the school. How am I going to fit that in? And that's problematical. And I think we're our own worst enemies in education. And I don't know why. It might be because we're just, people who go into education are pretty community minded. We see education as a way to make the world a better place and all that sort of thing. So we're quite idealistic, and most teachers are pretty decent and nice people. But what we don't do is, and I remember when I did my master's, I remember listening to a very wise teacher, and he said, at the end of every year, we should have this process of public abandonment that goes on throughout the school. Because as we get better at things, that ought to make it easier to do things. And there ought to be things that we were once doing that we now don't have to do because we found a better way of doing it. But we don't. We don't abandon past practices. As all we do is that we keep adding and adding and adding and adding to what and how we do things. And it's crazy. And, I say to schools, I said, look, think about how you publicly abandon the things that you don't need to do anymore. Because whether it's through adopting PLC or just something else, that we don't have to do that anymore because we've overcome that difficulty. And we don't do that. So it's fear, it's workload, and they're genuine issues in terms of why schools and people wouldn't want to do this. I think a lot of principals, they feel that workload. Can I load this one more thing onto the teaching staff? And it ought not be looked at like that. I think when schools go down this path, they have to say, of all the new things that we've done in the last 5 years, how effective have they been? Are we still doing them? Are they integrated into the work that we're doing? If not, we need to think about that. But if they are, as a result of implementing that, what do we no longer have to do? And make sure that we publicly abandon, because somewhere you'll find someone, and I've spoken to teachers, and you say, let's focus on, no, I can't do that. And the reason will be something that they think that they have to do. And you talk to the principal later on and say, we've been doing that for 10 years. But there's still a teacher who thinks that they do. So I think schools have got to really think about workloads and really what matters and what do teachers actually need to do. And I reckon there's a whole lot of things that teachers, a whole lot of things that teachers need to do.
So let me give you a scenario, Steve. Okay, you're my consultant. I've heard you about workload and fear. What I've done is I've restructured the timetable so that we've pulled out meetings, we've put PLCs in place. We've also designed the professional learning model separate to the annual review process. So there's a clear, this is not part of the review process. This is your individual collective growth. We're looking at student learning. We're looking at techniques. But then there's a real sort of sense of dragging your feet, the feet to get to the PLC meeting. That happens probably, once or twice a term. Let's just, say twice a term. And like when people get there, it's okay because they're having those conversations of learning, and that's something that they're missing in the staff room because they don't really do that at lunch or in their offices. So when they get there, there's a sense of, yes, this is working, but there's not that sense of the big picture in terms of we need to do this over time. And I think this is where PLCs falls. because you generally have, you know, your one or two drivers in the school that, you know, hold PLCs together and bring people on board, and, you know, they're the cheer squad. But over a period of time, what generally happens with PLCs is it starts falling apart. What can schools do, you know, in terms of keeping that PLC going? Because as we know, you know, they're only beneficial if you keep them going over a long term, and they're, you know, effective in your school community, and you're still having those learning and teaching conversations. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, look, I think there's two things that come to play in that scenario. One of them is trust, and I think the other is about communication and recognition of the work that we do. So often when schools will start off doing PLC, you know, they really try to play by the rules, you know, and some will call it, you know, PLC fidelity, you know, doing it the way in which it should be done. And there's nothing wrong with that. And I would even argue that when you start off as a school, that's a really good thing. So some schools will start off with a whole school inquiry. There'll be a big discussion, some data and all sorts of things, and there'll be a general consensus that there's a problem of practice that we could overcome. And, you know, even that term has become a little bit problem of practice. I find it, I think it's fine. It's not exactly what it is, but some people don't like that term because of it. Anyway, so we've identified a problem of practice, and we're all going to, at every grade level, every team, we're all to focus on this. And that problem of practice may buy-in from some teams as you do in others. That may be one reason. And then when it becomes more mature, you really have to open up and allow teams to develop their own agenda. So there might be a problem of practice that exists in year 4 that's completely different to, you know, at other year levels. So at some stage, PLC has to get to the point where teams are dictating the agenda, that they're smart enough, that they're wise enough, that they're observant enough, they've got the evidence. At grade 4, this is a problem of practice that we have in teaching reading, whatever it is. I'm a high school maths teacher, so I wouldn't even know what the problem of practice is. But they've, you know, they've worked. Yeah. In grade 2, it might be something completely different. So there's nothing wrong with all starting off with the same so that you can communicate the work, but you have to hand the leadership over to those people. Now, I think another thing that schools can do, and this is something I really try to encourage, and really you don't want inquiries going on too long. You know, that's another thing. You really get sick of it. So PLC leaders really have to be able to drive this. One inquiry, one term. You ought to be able to knock it off in that. And look, it may then lead to another inquiry that's similar sort of thing, but, you know, next level of complexity up, that's fine. But break them down into you know, short inquiries that are very digestible. And let's not forget that learning word in there, learning. This is about teacher learning. So at the end of the term, schools ought to have some sort of presentation of the learning that happened as a result of PLC throughout the term. So it might be that, you have each term will do a 5-minute presentation on what their inquiry was, what the problem of practice was, how they undertook the inquiry, what they did, how the data and evidence that they used, and what they're adding to the quality of teaching practice as a result of doing that inquiry. And in a sense, this is the school collecting that learning that's going on and sharing it amongst the whole school, which ought to happen. Because if it doesn't happen, well, it's not learning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you nailed it there. Yeah.
That seems to be missing in a lot of schools.
Mm-hmm. I think you just cut out. No, there was a moment there that you cut out, and I'm hoping it's okay. Yeah, blame Darwin. All right. So what is exciting for you? Like coming from the last few years, you sort of indicated before that, you know, PLCs sort of had faded away, probably because of COVID. And the work that schools are doing now, what's coming out that's really exciting for you?
In terms of work in this space?
Yeah.
I think the system's getting better and better. One of the things I'm really pleased about is the amount of resources that are going into coaching and the real need for that coaching. And it's clear that schools have interpreted, you know, some schools do it this way and some schools do it that way. And it really, I think if the system wasn't doing the coaching, we might have schools stuck in collaborative planning and only a few moving beyond that into really focusing on practice. And even though the PLC training that the system does is, I think it's 5 days spread over, a month or so, and it's pretty intense. You have to keep coming back to it. There's nothing that you can do that you can just do that and then leave it and everyone will be fine. If you're really serious about it, you have to back it up with that coaching and just, bringing people back and just, being a bit of a rock chucker, just asking some questions that, we forgot that, we've sort of overlooked that in the work that we do. Schools are incredible. It's amazing what schools achieve. It's amazing the input that its teachers and leaders put in to making a school work. And so it's really easy for stuff to just slip because of the complexity of the work environment, because of, kids are the most complex thing in the world. And you've got 25 of them there in the classroom, and you see what teachers do with kids. It's absolutely fantastic. This is really complex work. And the coaching, I think, is a great intervention to be able to continue the development for schools. And, like we try to meet kids at their point of need, with learning, we call it their zone of proximal development. Schools have their own zone of proximal development about their own practice. And I think one of the things that, coaching and coaches need to be able to do is to identify where that is. So, I would hope that, coaching is a part of this program for some time yet. Yeah,
I'm a big fan of coaching. I've always had a coach. Didn't matter what industry. And I think you're right. It's, someone to, because I think I'm fantastic.
I do too, Tanya.
But I need someone to actually coach me. But and I think that is the missing key in because I know in industries that I've been mentoring and coaching, they're quite big aspects in your roles, especially as you head into leadership. And I think that has been sort of probably the missing component. I mean, everyone trains to be a coach and then thinks because they've trained to be a coach that they don't need a coach themselves. And I think they need to remember that you always need a coach. Like, I've trained to be a coach, but like I said, I need someone to actually poke me to say, you know, well, tell me a little bit more about what you were thinking there, and, you know, what you would do next time. So yeah, no, I think so. If we've got coaching, I think coaching aligning with even those PLC leaders, you know, to keep PLCs going, that's actually a good connect if we can get there. Yeah.
Yeah. Being a PLC leader in a school's hard.
Yeah.
Hard work.
Okay, so thank you for coming on to Courageous Dialogues.
Lovely to be with you.
Is it snowing there? You've just moved recently. Is it snowing there?
It's the best start to the ski season for, I think, about 30 odd years. So I had my first ski the week before Queen's birthday, which rarely happens. There was tons of snow. It was fantastic. So as a result, the school holidays are really popular. Everyone's up there.
A colleague of mine.
It hasn't snowed there's been a little bit of snow.
A colleague of mine shared a picture where, what do you call them? You know, the chairs. There might be
chairlifts.
Chairlifts, thank you. They had like those big bins of water on each of the chairs because they were testing the chairlift. I'd never seen that before.
No, I'm glad they do.
Yeah, I just thought, wow, that's actually quite clever. Safety first.
Yeah. No, it's all runs very well. So I've actually bought myself a season lift pass, so I can just go on. And you'll recall I rang you up last week and said, do we have to do it on Monday? And the reason was that the weather forecast was fantastic for skiing.
It's like, I get it. Do you know? So it's 28 degrees. It's actually quite lovely in Darwin at the moment. But I did have a bit of a chuckle yesterday. There's people walking around with turtleneck jumpers. I even saw some trench coats. And my mum's like, put a jumper on. You're making me cold. I'm just like, really? Yeah, so...
I'm just looking here on the screen. It's 5 degrees here at the moment. And the funniest thing, walking around Mansfield, particularly in the morning, is kids going to school in shorts. And it's, there's been a frost, the grass is all crisped up, and, they're going to school in shorts. It's fantastic.